What's up, y'all, and welcome to the Idea Space. I'm Yancey Strickler. It's worse, much worse than you think. These are the opening lines of The Uninhabitable Earth, the best-selling and earth-shaking 2019 book by David Wallace Wells about the climate crisis. The first time I read The Uninhabitable Earth was a life-changing experience. The book shows that however scared you are of climate change, you're still likely underestimating the horrors that might await us. This picture remains grim. However, recently things have begun to change. In a recent article called After Alarmism, David Wallace Wells shared reasons for optimism. Things like massive improvements in solar and battery technology, a new paradigm for how we think about public money, and a growing belief in the business and government communities that decarbonization will happen and will be worth it. The world is ready to embrace decarbonization for economic reasons, as our recent conversation with venture capitalist Albert Wenger showed. Last week, I spoke with David Wallace Wells about where we are and where we're headed. In a deep and fascinating conversation, David shared what he's most worried about, the lessons learned through COVID, why our wildest fears are not going to come true, and the new economics of climate. The Uninhabitable Earth is a must-read, and this conversation is a must-listen. Here's David Wallace Wells. There's kind of dueling narratives right now about climate. I mean, there's a lot of narratives, but just in the past couple of weeks, been seeing Greta raise this UN report showing how woefully short we are going to be at various targets. But at the same time, see climatologist Michael Mann saying he can smell the change in the air. There's some optimism. You've talked about some ways that things are changing. So where are we now and what direction are we headed?
Well, so it's funny. I want, maybe the best way to start is to say climate change is not a matter of mood affiliation. It's whether I'm feeling slightly more optimistic or slightly less or whether it's all sort of trivial compared to the big picture trajectory. And that big picture trajectory remains bleak. We have basically foreclosed any futures that our grandparents would have recognized as comfortable and manageable. That's not to say that we can't figure out ways to manage them and even invent ways to live relatively prosperously and justly in that future, but it's going to take an enormous amount. That's how much we've squandered the time that we've had. And that's really bad. And for me, that's my baseline. But I also used to expect that we were heading towards something that would have appeared to just about anybody alive today, even those of us who are quite worried about climate, as a really alarming climate future. I thought that was the sort of path that we were on, and it would take unbelievably dramatic global action to avoid something like, say, 3 or 4 degrees Celsius of warming, which would mean, twice as much war, half as much food, hundreds of millions of climate refugees, $600 trillion in global climate damages, which is twice as much wealth as exists in the world today, parts of the world hit by 6 climate-driven natural disasters at once. I mean, you can really go down a list of truly, truly catastrophic outcomes. And I thought that's where we were headed. And we've done a lot over the last year or two to make sure that future is looking less and less likely, and that we would have to really try hard to bring ourselves to that level of warming this century at least, or be really surprised by some things in the climate system that we didn't expect to happen, like really dramatic feedback mechanisms that most scientists would tell you that aren't very likely. So it's sort of both things at once are true. The picture is still really bad, and yet it is much sunnier than it seemed a year or two ago. And I would say even much sunnier than I thought was possible it could look if you had asked me what a best case outcome would be, say, a couple of years ago. And I think often when people ask me the kind of question that you asked me, and when people talk about climate change in general, there is this it's a pattern and a problem that we fall into generally. We tend to think about big, important questions in binary terms, even when they're not binary problems. But it's not like we're heading down one path of it's going to be fine, or we're heading down another path of climate apocalypse. We're somewhere in the middle. Our best future is an ugly muddle. that will be defined by climate struggle and climate suffering. And our worst path is considerably worse than that. And we have to figure out, and I'm trying to figure out myself, both in my thinking and my writing, how to hold those two facts in my head at once and to think clearly about the future without relying on the kind of emotional and intellectual crutch of, the kind of reductive thinking that's like, we're making progress, it's looking good, or it's all going to hell and maybe we're going to go extinct. Because the truth is neither of those extreme scenarios are really all that relevant, and we have to learn how to take a more fine-grained perspective on the sort of narrower band of differences that we can make today through action today.
Yeah, you wrote that the good news, the quote good news, is that we're trending towards 2 degrees of warming. But even at 2 degrees of warming, you also write that as many people would die every year from climate as died of COVID last year. So that is the good. That is the
That's
good.
the like really happy outcome that we're heading towards. Yeah, and some of this is quite novelty of threat is really a big part of how we process these kinds of things. So um, it would be scary. It's scary enough to say what you said about climate and COVID. On the other hand, it's also the case that like 9 million people are dying of air pollution every year, and that's a horror. It's a moral outrage, and yet it isn't exactly like the central emotional or psychological or political fact of our lives at an individual level or at a global level. And so it's also worth keeping in mind, as depressing and distressing as it is, that we do process these degraded futures, and we continue to live in ways that are not defined by them, even if they should be. So along with everything else, I think we also have to keep in mind that we have, as humans, we have a capacity for adaptation. We also have an incredible capacity of normalization. And part of why I think it's so important to keep in mind the sort of bleakness of the path that we're on is that it counsels against that impulse.
So in the piece After Alarmism, you write like the first piece of good news is that the age of climate denialism is over. And so, Republicans in lockstep denying climate change not isn't the strategy anymore. Now it's more like it's too late. That's what you see Ben Sasse or Mitt Romney say. But then you wrote, quoting you, the second source of good news is the arrival on the global stage of climate self-interest. By this, I don't mean the profiteering logic of BlackRock, which opportunistically announced some half-hearted climate commitments, but rather the growing consensus in almost every part of the globe and at almost every level of society and governance that the world will be made better through decarbonization. A decade ago, many of the more ruthless capitalists to analyze that project deemed it too expensive to undertake. Today, it suddenly appears almost too good a deal to pass up. So, can you talk about climate self-interest? Like, where are you seeing this? Is this something new?
Yeah, I mean, for a really long time, people worrying about climate inaction would say, um, well, there are problems at a few different levels. At the level of sort of national decision making, we understood the costs of decarbonizing much more clearly than we understood the benefits of decarbonizing, and that meant that the argument for climate action was almost always cast in moral terms, not in economic terms. And there is a moral case, obviously, to be made for climate action. I don't want to discount that. But there are people who don't respond to that. And some of them are the most powerful people in our societies. And especially when when you had some really dramatic tabulations of what it would cost to like replace the oil and gas business with renewables, it really seemed like we would be taking a huge hit to do our part as a country, say, to produce a relatively comfortable future climate of the planet. And that was especially problematic. And people pointed to it thinking it was, an especially important cause of climate delay and inaction, if not quite true denial, because they also saw this problem played out on the global stage where to the extent there are benefits to decarbonizing, they are distributed globally. A world at 2 degrees Celsius is better for everybody, but it's not the case that if all California decarbonizes, that California is going to get all the benefits of that. It's going to actually probably be concentrated more in places like India and Bangladesh. Um, and, California fires are probably going to, forests are going to continue to burn for a few decades regardless. And that meant that the logic of immediate action at the local and national level, in addition to seeming too expensive, also seemed sort of pointless if the entire world wasn't moving in unison. Because, even take China, the world's biggest emitter, responsible for 28% of all global emissions, even if they went all the way to zero, if the whole rest of the planet kept emitting at the pace that they were emitting, the climate that China was living in, warming at only 3/4 of the rate it would have without, with China emitting, it's not going to change all that much. And both of these factors were, it's hard for me to really unpack the political science and say how significant they each were, but they were certainly pointed to as explanations for why the world was moving so slowly. And over the last year or two, for a number of reasons, which we can talk about, but ranging from political movements to actual natural disasters opening people's eyes to generational change, and a lot of other factors too, there's just been, I think, a genuine, tipping point on these questions. Economic analysis is now much more sophisticated on the question of the benefits of climate action, and on the question of the damages that would come from unchecked climate change, such that the cost benefit analysis of moving quickly is really, really clear when you're studying it, in your little office at MIT or Stanford or whatever. And that's not alone enough to change the whole path of the world's economic system, but it's something. And those, that sort of, we now know that, for instance, we could pay for the entire decarbonization of the American economy simply through the public health benefits that would come from the side effect of decarbonizing it through the cleaner air we would have. The air would be so much cleaner, the public health benefits would be so strong that alone would pay for the entire project of decarbonization, and we wouldn't have to worry about any of the other climate benefits. We wouldn't have to worry about the effect on droughts or wildfires or sea level rise or whatever else. And on top of that, because there's been a sort of conceptual step change, it's now the case that like every CEO in every boardroom is planning for a future predicated on at least moderately fast decarbonization. Like, that's not to say that, Larry Fink at BlackRock thinks that the world is going to decarbonize as fast as Greta Thunberg wants it to. Like, obviously not. And he's, they did this thing last year where they announced that they were sort of focusing on climate, but they continue to invest in oil and gas. They're just pulling back on coal. So it's, which is again a reflection of the dollars and cents, because coal is much less profitable than oil and gas still. And yet the fact that there is even that level of conversation, and even at a kind of like PR spin level, that like the corporate world and like the Davos sphere feels obligated to be talking about climate change, is, I think, a real cultural change, and one that we, those of us who are hoping for more ambitious movement, I think we have a reflex to discount those changes. And there's obviously reason to be skeptical and reason to hold those people to account. But it also is, I think, very much the case that a world in which every person of social, financial, political consequence feels obligated to be at least paying lip service to climate change is a world in which climate action is easier than one in which the majority of them don't even want to talk about it. And, as I said in the piece, and as I sort of said a minute ago, that's not to say that the battle is won. Like, we need to do a lot more, but the conditions of possibility have really changed as a result. And it's one of the reasons why the future, I think, looks relatively calmer and more stable than, emphasis on relatively, but relatively calmer and more stable than I thought a year or two ago. But to me, the biggest change is just like the cost of renewables is so low now. The innovations that were sort of kicked into gear in the 90s and early 2000s in Germany, in the late 2000s in the US, and more recently in China, driving down, particularly the cost of solar power, but also wind power, and now battery power too. It's just crazy. Like, renewables' biggest advocates a decade ago would not have told you that these price declines were possible. And, they're basically, all of these technologies have fallen at least tenfold in price over a decade. And we expect that they're going to continue to fall, which means that basically everywhere in the world, um, renewable energy represents a more economical option if you're making an investment in our energy future. Now, again, that's not to say that everybody will make those investments. It's still the case that most of the world's largest oil and gas companies are state owned, and these are not so the political economy of decarbonization is quite complicated and tangled. But again, the basic like playing field or landscape on which these decisions will be made used to look tilted against decarbonization, and now it's tilted towards decarbonization. And as I say in the piece, like, the challenges are hard. We've run out of time to save the planet that we knew, but we have to kind of take the good news where we can find it. And I do think, strangely, in a year of COVID and the year of pandemic, like, there actually was a lot of really good news on climate. And I don't think that that's entirely a coincidence, because I do think, especially in the US, there's a way in which the intensity of politics around an issue can stymie movement. And when things are done a little more off to the side, or under cover of night, or somewhat secretly, that not just that more things get done, but like the public is also sort of happier with the things that do get done, and that just keeps the ball rolling forward.
Yeah, it feels like there was an assumption in the past that decarbonization would be anti-capitalist, or like that there was you'd have to rip up the whole system. And then now maybe what we're finding is that decarbonization and capitalism are more compatible than maybe anybody thought. Do you think that's fair?
Yeah, I mean, I think for a long time, this sort of conceptual, I mean, these frames are so, again, they're so misleadingly binary. Like, yes, we live in largely a market capitalist system, but also our markets are totally distorted by the political economy that governs them, such that, the IMF says we're subsidizing fossil fuels $5 trillion a year, which, to give a sense of perspective, in theory, that would be enough to pay for direct air capture machines to suck all of the carbon out of the atmosphere all around the globe. So, like, we're giving enough money. There are engineering complications with this, but just as a sort of shorthand to give you a sense of the scale of the subsidy, we're subsidizing the business that's destroying the future of the planet as much or more than would be required for us to continue running those companies, burning all that fuel and sucking all the carbon out of the air so that it didn't make any difference at all to the future of the planet. And there are market complications everywhere you look. So I think it's always been a little bit naive or simplistic to think that, like, because the system that we have today is producing this catastrophic outcome, that means that we necessarily have to discard every aspect of the system and build from scratch. On the other hand, I'm sympathetic to a lot of other critiques of capitalism that make me also interested in renovating more than just the fossil capitalist elements of it. And I think that that's been one complicating thread in the climate movement, really since the beginning, that, a lot of people who turn to environmentalism turn to it in part out of distaste for other aspects of human society, see nature and the cause of nature as a sort of alternate approach to life on this planet, which they find more fulfilling. And I think for the most part, that's, a good and healthy impulse, but it can occasionally lead to sort of, lead you to some sort of anti-human places where you hear from people who are, want to control the population of the planet, or, believe that it's just to essentially impose continued poverty on parts of the developing world as a way of stabilizing some of the planet's ecosystems. And, my own politics, I mean, I'm a person of the left, but like my own politics are idiosyncratic enough, and also, I guess, not at core environmental ultimately enough, that it seems to me more like, we want a sort of big tent political approach that is also draws on solutions from a variety of places, and appeals to a variety of different constituents as a result. So, you know, like when I see stats that, you know, the richest 1% of the world are responsible for more emissions than the bottom half of the planet's, you know, judged by wealth, you know, that does make me think that there is probably some wisdom in like what's called degrowth, that like people like you and me are not just using more than our fair share, but we're abusing our positions of privilege. Even when we're like doing good in the world, we're still actually doing badly. But I also think that, you know, an approach to global warming that requires every rich person on the planet to abandon their comforts is going to be an approach that requires a revolution to put into place, and a global revolution. And you know, like I said, I think I'm sympathetic. There are parts of me that are sympathetic to that, but I'm also like, do we have the time to do that? Do we have the political will? Like, you know, are we sure that we could like build it up from scratch? And so I think my own approach is to say, okay, like the fact that, you know, Elon Musk, imperfect savior as he is, has produced, you know, a culture of electric cars and an expectation, in part through his insane, you know, missionary zeal, that the world of electric cars will be, you know, that we will be living in a world of electric cars a decade from now. You know, I applaud him for that. There
And
are things he's doing that I would not applaud him for, but like, you know, I'll take that. And then when I see, you know, VW and there was another major manufacturer today, I forget which, Volvo, said that they were going to go all electric by 2030. You know, it's really incredible when you think how quickly that culture of expectations has changed at the consumer level, at the boardroom level, and at the level of sort of political economy. That, like, you know, there are those who say in order for us to avoid catastrophic warming, we can't ever sell a single additional non-electric vehicle anywhere in the world. We're not going to do that. But like 2 years ago, if you had said the world's going to be basically off internal combustion engines by 2030, that would have felt impossible too. And it kind of feels like that's where we're headed.
I mean, it's interesting to think about Elon as a figure who grows the tent, and even, you know, the strategy of Tesla from the beginning to start with like the sports car, to make an electric car not about being green, but about, you know, touching on all these other desires that we have. It seems like explicitly from the beginning, it was trying to grow that tent. You wrote about in this last piece, After
But can
Alarmism,
I say one other thing
about
about that?
yeah, please,
Yeah.
please.
I mean, I think one thing that I always, and I say this perhaps as someone who feels a little bit embarrassed by his own history of indifference to climate and some amount of what I recognize as hypocrisy in my own life about these issues. But I also think it's really important for us to, like, in fighting for change, understand that large political movements contain hypocrites and like that is okay. That like if what you're trying to do is be a purist, then you're going to end up on a commune, and that commune may be really utopian and ideal, but we're not dreaming of a future in which there are a few patches of responsible living here and there on the planet. This challenge is so big that we need everyone to change, and that means we need to come up with solutions that at least most people are at least comfortable with and maybe even excited about. And, you know, among many other things, it means, I think, not calling out people who are not exactly where you are, but are basically on board with large scale change,
Mm.
and recruiting, you know, people who you can convince that a Tesla is cool, as opposed to just saying like all the people with the Subaru Outbacks are the only people we're going to be selling these cars to.
Yeah, yeah. No, it has to be. I mean, I often hear Kara Swisher talk about how the world's first trillionaire will be, you know, someone that worked on the climate. And I work with a number of young entrepreneurs, you know, people in their 20s and younger, who have startups that are climate based. And, you know, it strikes me that some of these people have already become very wealthy through this work. It's like there's no moral ambiguity. It's not like they're extracting user data to sell, to advertise. It's like a purely a missionary zeal kind of project. And there's times that I feel almost jealous of like the clarity of mission, the impact, like I feel sometimes like the sort of the greatest generation idea of, being forced in World War II to step up, and then through that, manifesting this larger thing. But I feel like there is that energy that's coming, and especially for these younger entrepreneurs, they might want to talk to me about how do I do this in like a more ethical, cool way because of Kickstarter. They think of me maybe that way, but generally my advice is like your goal is to be as big as possible. Your goal is for Amazon to like copy everything you do. Like this is a different kind of challenge, and so there is like a moral clarity that feels different.
Yeah, I mean, obviously I have less experience and engagement with the sort of entrepreneurial side of things than you do, but I find myself, routinely amazed by climate activists, teenage climate activists in particular. I mean, Greta's the clearest, most famous example, but this is a movement like the climate strike movement that is led by teenagers all around the world. Many of them, none of them with the right to vote. None of them are old enough to vote in the countries even where they have where adults have the right to vote. Some of them are in much more authoritarian environments. Many of them are from ethnic marginalized ethnic communities. Many of them are queer. These are people who are basically like the least powerful people you could possibly imagine on the planet. And I think of people like you and me, not not to like disparage your climate engagement or whatever, but like we would often look at this problem and think, oh, it's so big. What can we do? Like, what can one person do? What can even one outspoken public person do? It's just such a huge challenge, which is true. It is that, and it is intimidating, to to anyone who's hoping to make a difference. But the generation of climate strikers in particular face those challenges and at an even more intimidatingly high scale. They were even more disempowered and even farther from the levers of political power than you and I are, and they were not intimidated. And they had the opposite response. They thought, I'm going to make room for myself at this table, even if there's never been room for me before, and change the course of the planet as a result. And, amazingly, in just a couple of years, they truly have. This movement is the most visible, most memorable part of the transformation that we were talking about at the top of this conversation. That there has been large-scale global political activism on climate over the last couple of years, led by teenagers. It's just unthinkable. Like these are the kinds of protests, the kind scales of protests that we used to only see very periodically in certain pockets of the world in response to like wars of choice or, in certain cases to protest,
I think we've gotten
a
disconnected here.
brutal political regime. And then we're seeing it everywhere in the world all at once, against a cause that, we were told for a very long time was going to be impossible to mobilize people on.
I was really struck by a conversation you referenced, talking to Elizabeth Colbert, and her mentioning the E.O. Wilson half Earth concept. And she says to you, one big conservation proposal that's out there is E.O. Wilson's half Earth. We should put a half of the planet aside for other species. But even that, which I would certainly support, isn't really conserving the world. That's changing the world. That's not the world that we had. And I found that interesting because, I think for some people, if the end result is like a more electrified, renewable world that's otherwise status quo, that would be awesome. But for other people, maybe that would feel like that isn't a success. And it struck me as there's like a lack of clarity about what a successful transition looks like. And probably we all have different ideas in our head of what that is. But what did you feel when she expressed that about like not wanting to change the world or the tension of that?
Well, what I took her to mean is more is was less uh like it was I took it to be less of a normative comment and more of a what's the other kind of it's like she's not making a judgment, she's just describing what's happening. And I think her new book Under a White Sky represents a sort of right turn for her. It's not a dramatically different perspective than she's expressed in her previous writings about the sort of environment and the catastrophic destruction that we're engineering there. But it starts from the proposition that whatever your naturalist or preservationist impulses might be, we're too far gone to really dream responsibly of a return to nature. She also writes in the book, I think, quite well about the way in which even our idea of nature is really a creation of its own destruction. Like when we lived, not to engage in like sophomoric evolutionary biology, but like when we were hunters and gatherers on like the savannas of Africa, we didn't think of nature as being something. It was just the world. And we started to think of it really when we became, when we had engineered enough new stuff on the planet that we started to see a difference there. I mean, a lot of the thinking about the natural world and the writing about the natural world that, in the West formed the basis of the environmental worldview came out of Victorian England, which was a time, an age and a culture that was rapidly changing, in which you could see over the course of a generation that the total transformation of a landscape or a city or, a town. And that is how we know nature, is through its destruction. And so as we move forward, I think she would say it may be a hindrance to cling to ideas of a pure, protected, non-human, untouched environment to which we might hope to return to some degree. And that we need to think seriously about what it means to be living in this mishmash of a place where, literally there was a finding this year that like literally half of the world's mass is human made and half of it is not human made. So it's like we're in this like perfect balance point at the moment, although it's, certain to move in the wrong direction from here. And her book is really about this sort of tricky challenge of carrying forward the values of environmentalism into a world in which, nature is no longer a meaningful category. But, it's also the case, of course, that in addition to being important for us to, if not abandon, then at least refine the way that we think of nature and the natural world and the natural environment, it's also important for us to remember that we still live inside nature, all of us, and that we are part of it. Not that we might as well be living on a different planet than the one that we're destroying. And so I think there's sort of like, in certain ways, complementary and in certain ways contradictory messages there that, we need to sort of like, we need to move on from earlier, possibly naive ideas of what the natural world is and should be and what its values are. And at the same time, we also need to understand that as much as we've transformed that world, we still live in it and live with its consequences. And if we want those consequences to be relatively less brutal, we gotta move quick. But on the half Earth question in particular, and the sort of conservationist spirit in particular, I think it's hard to make categorical assessments. Some conservationist projects have obviously been valuable. There are other things like massive tree planting that's been done that turns out to have been environmentally destructive, even though it was done in the name of environmental campaigns. And, what I keep coming back to is the changing way that we'll see these categories as it becomes clear just how transformed they are. So, I've been turning over in my head a lot recently this series of papers that have come out over the last year about the likelihood that most of the world's forests will become what are called carbon sources rather than carbon sinks in just a few decades. So, at the moment, one of the best ways that we can take carbon out of the air is to is for there to be more plant life, and particularly more tree life that can absorb it and store it in bark and in trees, and then also in the soil, etc. And that really comports with a sort of old-fashioned idea of what nature is and the role of nature in this sort of contest between the world humankind inherited and the world that we are making. And it allows you to see things like the Amazon or the redwood forest or whatever as this unspoiled paradise, almost Edenic, to which we can occasionally like turn and visit, even if we live outside of it, even if we live in like the degraded, fallen world of man and industry, and which shames us or should shame us into taking better care of those parts of the planet that aren't as well protected. It's a sort of like it's a morality. It's like forest as morality tale, but it's also forest as like meditative retreat and escape from the pain of human existence. And I wonder what that's going to feel like, and whether those categories and those intuitions about what a forest is are going to hold if 3 decades from now, globally, forests are actually contributing to the problem of global warming rather than aiding it. And that the more trees there are on the planet, the worse off we'll be rather than the better off we'll be. Now, obviously, forests are like, there's natural beauty. There are a lot of things we like about that stuff, those places, that is not contained in the simple equation of like, are they adding more carbon? Or are they subtracting carbon? But if we're imagining a world that is really defined, not just in a scientific way, but in a cultural and political way by the struggle of climate, it's also not hard to imagine that intuition about what forest life is and stands for being really, if not totally reversed, then disrupted. And that's just really weird to me. And I say that even as someone who has lived his whole life in cities, who is not like, I'm not an outdoorsman. It's not like it's not like I go on meditation retreats in the forest ever. So I have a very like childhood storybook conception of what that part of the natural world stands for. And yet I see it already as being deeply out of touch with the trajectory of the planet, and suspect that a few decades from now we might collectively relate very, very differently to nature than we do today. And that goes doubly so for coral reefs, or for oceans in general. The changes are just so dramatic that we may begin to see, we now have nature tourism. We go on vacations to like experience this untouched beauty. But it's becoming already a lot harder to not see the destruction of those places when we look hard enough. And, it's like my mother-in-law went on a cruise to the Arctic in the spirit of like, before it's gone. Mm-hmm. And I know a lot of people who've done coral reef expeditions, gone to Australia thinking like, I got to do this with my teenager now, because by the time she's got teenagers of her own, it's not going to be there. And the number of places that will be seen in those terms, I think, is going to grow somewhat dramatically over the next couple of decades in a way that really, really, it'll really rewire the way that we think about nature in general. And I don't know that we're really prepared for that all that much.
Yeah, I hear the phrase climate adaptation thrown around a lot lately. It's very benign sounding, and I think we have some sense of what that means in terms of infrastructure, redoing the grid, all that kind of stuff. But I'm curious about like the cultural and social adaptations. The kinds of things you're talking about here, or even wonder if you look at like the teenage activists. Is there anything there that we can look at and think about how our lives and decisions are different in a world where like climate is front and center?
Well, actually, the thing that comes to mind, and this may be a little strange coming from me, but I worry about coming of age thinking that you are in the midst of an apocalypse. And I think that I think it's inevitable that climate suffering will increase probably dramatically, and that there will be much more pain in the world as a result of our inaction and delay than we would like. But I also think, in ways that we have a hard time imagining from the vantage of today, we will figure out some ways of living amidst that wreckage and suffering, um, to allow ourselves the possibility of, comfortable and fulfilling lives, however we define them. And I do think that there is a sort of it's a strange feature of the kind of the activism that we've seen today. And again, it's strange for me to saying it. I may be even offering this as a sort of like self-critique, but there is a sort of millennial spirit to it, which suggests, like, it may be uncomfortable or strange for many of these people to be living 30 or 40 years from now, seeing that things have gotten worse, wishing that we could have done more to avoid it, and yet, like, living in ways that are more like the lives of their parents than they maybe thought when they were teenagers. And when the grip of apocalypticism gets you, it's sort of hard to let go. And I do worry about that a bit. At the political level, you mentioned the sort of turn on the right from climate denial to climate indifference. That's really something I worry a lot about. The psychological well-being of the climate strikers, I worry less about. They're really resilient and sort of have an enormous amount of intellectual and emotional integrity. And I think one reason why they are millennials, millennialists or millenarians, is because they do see much more clearly the suffering of the world, and I think that's a virtue rather than a failing. Anyway, on the climate right, the opposite dynamic applies, which is that there is a real tendency to become more self-interested in a world of scarcity than you might have been in a world of plenty. And I think that one of the profound changes that climate change may bring to especially cultures like the US and Western Europe that have been really raised over the last few decades on expectations of ever increasing prosperity is, we may return to something more like a zero-sum view of the world. In fact, in parts of the world, we already are doing that or have done that. But those changes may accelerate or intensify. And, a lot of people in the climate movement worry about what they call climate fascism, which is, basically using the logic of climate change to justify some form of fascism. I think it probably in most cases won't get that bad, although you could imagine in a few particular countries that are really suffering something quite dramatic going on. But I think what's quite likely, even inevitable, is some form of climate nationalism or intensified climate nationalism, in which, just to take one very obvious example, the nations of the West, relatively prosperous and positioned relatively well to endure the changes of climate change compared to nations of the equatorial band of the planet and the global South, the nations of the West sort of close their doors on migrants from the rest of the world who are being forced to flee their homelands and their ancestral homelands, to flee their whole culture, but because of changes that were initiated certainly by Western nations and have been powered largely by the consumption patterns of Western people, for half century or more, and that will, if that happens, which I think it likely will to some degree, we will be adding to the climate burden of the global South somewhat significantly by refusing to accommodate or alleviate it to the extent that we can, in the same way that today we don't support the needs of those suffering desperately around the world at anything like the scale that we should, if we were, being really genuine, honest, moral actors. And as with all of the stuff we're talking about, I think it's not the case that it's like one path or another. It's not I don't think a utopian future in which like there's total open borders and, you know, the US and the UK and the EU and maybe China like pay to resettle all of Bangladesh. Like I don't think that's very likely either. Um, and so the question is like on the margin, how many of these people are we going to let settle in our countries? How warmly will we welcome them? How comfortable will our will the native populations be in receiving them? How all of that stuff is a matter of it's where you fall on a spectrum, and I want to push towards more empathy and more openness, but there are forces out there who are going to be pushing in the other direction, not just because of the logic of climate change, but in ways that, the logic of climate change makes their own logic more seem to them clearer. And one last thing I would say is, you could talk about this category of questions all day, like sort of, but I'm really interested in what all of this does to geopolitics in particular. And it's unfolding at a time in which there is this sort of like uncertain future. The power dynamic of the planet is, whether the US really sits at the global steering wheel in an ongoing way or whether China assumes that position in the next few decades is very much an open question. And I think the way that each of those countries relate to climate change is going to be a big part of that dynamic. But I also think, we err in assuming that geopolitical patterns that have held in the past are good guides to what the future will be. And I say this even, quite recently. I found, for a long time, I found myself thinking, okay, if um, a lot of people in the climate movement, climate world thought like if we're going to take action on this at a global scale, it's going to require something like the Paris Accords imagined, like global coordinated action led by the biggest, most powerful countries in the world, with everyone else following, some amount of subsidy from the rich to the poor, but to what extent, and who knows. But it'll have to be like a utopian vision, like the world coming together to deal with this global problem. And what's really been remarkable about the last year of climate action for me is how so many countries have announced really dramatically ambitious climate plans, totally independent of one another, outside of the negotiating rooms of something like the Paris Conference, and without even talking to one another, because they see so clearly now that decarbonization is in their individual self-interest in addition to being a sort of moral good for the world as a whole. And, there's about to be another COP conference. There'll be more climate conferences going forward. Like, obviously, that track of conversation will continue. It'll be a part of the dynamic of how the world governs this. And we're already starting to see new forms of climate governance emerging with countries, threatening sanctions against bad behaving other countries. And, the Brexit treaty involved all this climate stuff. But I think it may be much more scattered and decentralized an approach than anyone might have assumed 3 or 5 years ago, in part as a reflection of the changes we were talking about a little while ago, in which the market logic of decarbonizing is just so obvious that you don't need to bully or cajole one another to get nations there. It's sort of like we're going to be moving there no matter what we do. The question is how fast and how comprehensively. And I don't even know. I wouldn't even hazard a guess as to say like what institutions or forces are likely to be driving those questions either. But I would say, looking at the last couple of years, personally, I've been shocked at how fast the movement has already been, and would not be surprised to see it accelerate, quite dramatically in the years ahead, which is necessary because even at the pace of change we're seeing today, which, like I said, was unthinkable to me a few years ago, we're still so far short of where we'd want to be if we want to sort of get a handle on things. And just to put a data point on that, it's not a perfect survey, but the UN just put out a sort of state of the climate state of climate action report, in which they found that as part of the Paris Accords, governments are supposed to submit promises to the UN to say, here's what we're going to do. And to this point, all of the promises that have been submitted amount to, at most, a 1% reduction in global greenhouse gas emissions by 2030, when the UN has also said that in order to give us a decent chance of avoiding catastrophic warming, we need to cut those gases by 45% by 2030. So we're at 1%, we need to get to 45. Now, there are a lot of promises and announcements that have been made that aren't included in that calculus. So like China made a big net zero announcement. It's not part of that, and that is really significant. But it also tells you just how, as fast as things seem to be moving, even at the level of promises and pledges, which aren't even themselves like something you can take to the bank, even so, we need to be doing so much more.
When you see one of those pledges, what do you look for to know if it's real or not?
Well, I think the best rule of thumb is just like how quickly the changes are coming. So if a company or a country is saying we're going to be at net zero by 2050, so we'll be offsetting whatever remaining carbon emissions we have, that's really a different kind of a promise than saying we're going to ban electric vehicles by 2025. Even if the scale of the impact of the 2050 target is much bigger, like saying that we're going to take a concrete policy measure immediately and really dramatically change even a relatively small aspect of our carbon footprint is sort of more encouraging and more exciting. And then to the extent that some things need to be planned for on longer timelines, you just want those plans to be spelled out in detail rather than just sort of like notionally suggested, like we'll get there.
No
A lot
problem.
of climate activists also think that the sort of framework of net zero is misleading, and that we don't want to depend on negative emissions or offsets at any scale. So that especially the wealthy countries of the world, and especially those like the UK and other parts of, and lots of Scandinavia that have already really begun decarbonizing somewhat rapidly, that we shouldn't tolerate net zero pledges from them. We should really be pushing them to get to true zero. And I think that's probably valid, although as with everything else, I kind of want to celebrate progress, even if it's inadequate progress.
I'd love to ask just a couple more questions if you got time.
Yeah, let's do it.
So, coming off of like the Texas infrastructure fail, um, I see like two clear lessons from that. One is that we need better, more reliable infrastructure everywhere. Like everywhere in the world has, is perhaps even, more vulnerable than that. But another lesson that I take from that is that I, as a person, can't count on my infrastructure, and that I need to provide for myself, or I need to be in a community with other people who can provide for ourselves. And so there's just this kind of tension of like wanting a better state, but also like thinking, what can I really count on at this point? So I'm curious, like, how do you think about self-reliance or, institutional reliance, all those sorts of things moving forward?
Well, ideally, the self-reliant community that you would be depending on is the state. Because state capacity so dramatically outscales anything that small scale actors can manage, especially when it comes to things like energy efficiency and infrastructure, that if you are really retreating from those from that level of political organization, you're really depriving yourself of a lot of the you know capacity for resilience that the state can offer. But of course, we don't live in an ideal world, and my own impulse, I think, my own instinct would be to say that what we want to try to do is to coach um, our states to be more responsible and responsive. And when I say states, I mean like the political apparatus under which we live, not like California or Texas or whatever, although that too. And I do think that, climate change itself is pushing our states in that direction. But there are a huge number of obstacles, in California, for instance, like, half of all residential development since 1990 has been in wildfire prone zones. That's in part because nobody wants dense housing in the like desirable parts of the state, and so people have to build out into less desirable, more dangerous parts of the state. Um, we that California fancies itself a climate conscious place, and to most, by most standards it is, and yet other political and social considerations get in the way of really responsible planning and policy. And again, that's true in a place that is, you know, most Californians would tell you that climate is one of the values of the state, and if you can't count on really exemplary gold standard policy there, then it does make it hard to imagine in other places, especially a place like Texas, where nominally much of the state's political apparatus and the political culture is really opposed to the sort of values and virtues of the climate movement. On the other hand, Texas is like one of the leaders in renewable energy, because they just had, it was like a business opportunity, and they took it. So I think that like a lot of these dynamics run in sort of countervailing ways, and it's a little hard to plan concretely for the future. And when I look at a place like, Miami Beach, FEMA did like some contingency planning, proposing, or maybe it was the Army Corps, I don't remember, the Army Corps of Engineers, one of them, like where you would want to build seawalls to protect Miami. And they sort of decided to advise the city to build those barriers on the mainland, because the cost of building them would be relatively small, and the upside of protecting most of that property would be high. But to not even bother protecting the barrier island of Miami Beach and all the other barrier islands there, which you would basically just be forsaking and letting drown. And on some level, it's like a horror and like a moral abomination and a political failure, and makes you really distrust and doubt the leadership and support that you could get from a state like Florida facing climate impacts like these. And I think they've also already basically said that like they're not going to do anything to protect any of the keys. On the other hand, like, I don't know that it's not wise. Like, if you were to, I saw one estimate that like to totally protect all of the East Coast of the US would require spending about $1 million a person who lives there. And on some level, like, you want to think we should do that. On another level, it's like, if what you do is give people some subsidy to allow them to move and build better infrastructure in places where settlements can be built more densely and better protected against climate impacts, that's probably better than just building a giant wall around the entire country. Although there are going to be parts of the country that have giant walls around them too. Like there's going to be, almost certainly, there'll be a seawall in New York Harbor, because the real estate here, unlike even Miami Beach, which is really expensive real estate, the real estate here is just way too expensive. So like, we're living in a really ugly world where we're having to make these calculations and trade-offs. And at least my first emotional impact is to say how horrible it is that our state is like just hanging us out to dry here. But then I look at the experience of, say, Houston over the last couple of decades, and really the whole Gulf Coast, where there's been a catastrophic mismanagement of federal flood insurance, when private insurers were like, we're not going to give you home insurance for these places because they're going to be flooding a lot. The federal government basically just expanded its program and didn't hold homeowners to any higher standard than they had been before. As a result, there was a huge amount of development in those parts of the country in what were seen by insurance companies, which aren't even especially forward-thinking when it comes to climate, as essentially unbuildable. And yet we've like expanded the footprint of Houston by a huge amount, the population, and expanded out into these wetlands that are really dangerous, these floodplains that people just shouldn't be living in. So these are really like complicated questions. It's not as simple as saying, is the state going to be there for me or is it not? Because oftentimes the state being there for you is a disincentive to real change that is necessary. And, That's not to say I'm defending the governor of Texas or whatever, or whoever set up the ERCOT grid. It's like, it's obviously a broken system. But I also think it's, we often fool ourselves into thinking that the solution is as simple as like being on the right side of the issue. And we're sort of well past the point in climate history when things were as simple as that, because we are already seeing dramatically more storms, dramatically more flooding, dramatically more wildfire, dramatically more droughts, more climate migration, all of these things. We're seeing enough more of it that we can no longer just say, being like a Democrat and supporting like some climate policy is sort of sufficient. And all that we would ask of our government is that they're like, that they believe the science, to coin a term. We're sort of beyond the place of science in the realm of, of politics. And that means, reckoning with real trade-offs, each side of which have huge downsides. And then the big picture question, to return to, what you asked me before I started rambling, I think that like the only hope that we have of really protecting each other at a large scale way is by reinvesting in state capacity. At the level of like paying taxes, but also at the level of just like cultural perspective and trying to rebuild our faith that government can be a force for good. Like, they will be imperfect. There will be things that private forces do better, but like no rich person or corporation is going to be as rich or powerful as the US government anytime. And if we're talking about, making really dramatic, large scale investments and changes, the most powerful actor there is always going to be the state. And I think it's a tragedy in many ways, not just on climate at all, that culturally we've, so internalized the values of, the Reagan Thatcher revolution that we basically distrust the capacity of centralized governments to do good and to be efficient. And I think, we're living with the sort of catastrophic impacts of that cultural change all the way down the line, not just in the US, but really all around the world. And I think if we have a hope of responding to climate, but also responding to other inequities and injustices, it sort of requires a return to faith in the state. And that's probably going to require some amount of like leap of faith on the part of individuals, but also really protracted, focused trust building on the part of political leaders. And on that point, I am sort of encouraged in a big picture way to see just how dramatically the boundaries of economic discourse have changed, in particular over the last couple of years, but more broadly since the Great Recession. It really used to be the case that like almost every powerful government in the world, advised by almost every pedigreed economist in the world, would prefer a market solution to almost any problem in the world. And for a number of reasons, in part because we've struggled so much to deal with many of the challenges over the last decade, that just isn't the consensus anymore. And there are a number of very prominent voices who take a very different approach. I'm thinking in particular of Mariana Mazzucato and Stephanie Kelton, but there are many, many others, and it really has reshaped the way that especially people on the left all over the world are thinking, but even people on the right are talking about industrial policy in a much more comfortable and agreeable way. And they're talking about deficits in a much more forgiving way. When Barack Obama signed the Stimulus Act that closed, in 2009, it was $800 billion. And it produced the Tea Party, and it produced this huge backlash that we're still living with. In Europe, they went even deeper from sort of immediate recession stimulus into austerity, and that was catastrophic in its own way. And in response to contrast it with the response to COVID, we've just spent so much more money than that. The total amount of money that the U.S. has spent on COVID stimulus is now like $5 trillion, and it's probably going to go up from there. There's even more being spent all around the world, and there's starting to be little hints here and there of people worrying about inflation or worrying about whether we're spending too much money. But we're talking about a stimulus package that's like 6 times the size of the biggest stimulus package in American history, that was signed just a decade ago. And there's much, 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 much less Sturm und Drang about what it means. There's much, much, much more willingness among central bankers to support spending of this kind, and really a re-expansion, I think, of the state, social welfare aspects of the state, but also just the state generally. And we'll see how long that lasts. I think, I don't think it's like a permanent new normal, but I also don't know that it's going to expire as soon as like we get 60% of the population vaccinated. I think that we have moved into a conceptually different space in which we may debate the size of spending packages and that sort of thing, but we won't be tyrannized by fear of inflation and the bond market in the way that we were for a generation or two, almost as like with those fears sort of policing the ideology of the Reagan Thatcher revolution and making sure that like we didn't get too far outside of our own impulses towards austerity, even in times of scarcity. And I think that all means that like there is an open future that may allow for a much more robust response to all of these challenges. But as I say, like, it's not a binary thing. It's not like we're going to leave behind austerity and embrace, the new profligacy, and that's it. We're off to the races. Like, there are going to be fights ever on. And I think ultimately that's one of the most important lessons of all of this is like, as with COVID, like, it's not a simple matter of like deposing the leader who didn't believe in science and replacing him with a leader who does believe in science. Like, there are much, much more complicated, thorny challenges embedded in any crisis as big and deep as this one. And we're going to need more than just like the willingness to vote for the better of the two guys to really get a handle on it.
You wrote in The Uninhabitable Earth, if you had to invent a threat grand enough and global enough to plausibly conjure into being a system of true international cooperation, climate change would be it. And yet we are only unbuilding these alliances, recoiling into nationalistic corners and retreating from collective responsibility and each other. You wrote this in 2018, so this is Trump era especially. In that context, like, COVID feels like a gift. It's a gift to, it's a clearer threat than climate change. It wasn't as much as a layup as maybe it could have been, considering Trump and a lot of the things that happened. But it really does feel like an amazing opportunity for us to press pause and learn how to collaborate in a different kind of way. And so I'm wondering, how do you think about that passage after COVID?
Well, I think that it's such a complicated story, and I'm actually working on a piece right now about taking big picture stock of the pandemic, and the main lesson of the main I don't know what to say, like the big theme. I think that like the headline of the story will be how the West lost COVID. I think that as Americans, we often we have overestimated not just the influence of President Trump, who is a catastrophic leader in a time of crisis, but also the efficacy and importance of public policy in general. When you look at California, basically has the same death rate as Florida, and like Gavin Newsom's plan hasn't been perfect, but like Florida is basically like run in the direction of the disease. And, the nation's highest death rate is in New Jersey, not in Texas. And, we basically didn't try to do mass testing. We didn't try to do contact tracing. And not only that, we didn't really try to do any of that anywhere in Europe or South America either. And when you look at the outcomes of the global outcomes, per capita death rates, it really is just like by far the best predictor of how you're going to do as a country is like where you are on the globe. Europe, North America, and South America are in like one bundle where everybody's done really badly. The US is not exceptional in that bundle at all. And then there's East Asia and Oceania, who did much, much better. And then there's the sort of the global South, which is a slightly complicated story because of the age structure of their population. They could sort of tolerate much more infection without dying very much. But like pulling back just to think that this is we told ourselves in places like the US and the UK and Germany and whatever, that like we were beyond the reach of something like a pandemic. And then we were taught, in fact, not only were we as vulnerable as everyone else, we were much more vulnerable because we were unable to do the things that were done in South Korea or Japan or Australia or New Zealand that allowed them to actually preemptively move aggressively enough to essentially eliminate the disease. We never were able to do that. We only moved when the disease forced us to move. And I've watched again and again this speech that Mike Ryan, who's he's one of the leading guys at the WHO and has done a ton of stuff with Ebola, gave in the middle of March when someone asked him what lessons he took from his experiences with Ebola. And he was just like, be fast, have no regrets. The virus will always get you if you take too long to move. And he said the problem with many of our societies at the moment is that we're too afraid of failing. We can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. We have to move quickly no matter what. And that's a paraphrase, not a quote, but that's his basic spirit. And that has been the story of the pandemic across the West. We moved too slowly. We tried to be too perfect. We were unhappy with tests that were only 95% accurate instead of 99.9% accurate. We were unwilling to tell people that masks reduced your risk without making you totally, we're like, well, if it's not a perfect protection, we have to tell them they're pointless. We didn't stand up any of these sort of medical health infrastructure systems that we might have, to help secure and stop the disease. All of these things that we could have done, we didn't do, and to the extent that we took action, we took it only when there was catastrophic outbreak already locally. So part of it was, and there's a really long answer to your question, but part of it is like a kind of European Orientalism in which we looked at China, we said, oh, there's an outbreak there. We're not going to get sick because they eat dirty animals there. And we don't have to do a lockdown like Wuhan because they're crazy authoritarians and it's nothing to them. It's not a sign of desperation. In Asia, they all saw what happened in Wuhan and they were like, oh no, this is really serious. We got to freak out. But then when the disease came to Italy, it wasn't like the other countries of Europe were like, okay, now it's here. Now we really got to freak out. They were like, okay, it's in Italy. Let's see what happens. And when it came to New York, it was the same. There were precautions taken, there were measures taken around the world, around the country, but really we were unable to build out any of the preemptive capacity that was necessary until the disease had already gotten to that local place. And at which point much of that work was unnecessary or, pointless. And yet, thinking globally, the response to this disease has been completely unprecedented in all of human history. And, never before have societies taken preventative measures at anything approaching the scale or for anything approaching the duration that we've taken during this pandemic. And that's true across these three categories. It's true not just in East Asia and Oceania, not just in the global South, but in the global North and the West too. There was a period of time where 5 billion people on the planet were effectively quarantining at home. There was more than 1 billion school kids out of school. Economies were totally shut down. Personal lives were totally suspended. Romantic lives were suspended out of concern for ourselves and one another. And governments stepped in to really pick up the slack. The average person out of work in America during the pandemic made more money from unemployment insurance than they made before the pandemic. Some programs were even more generous across Europe. We did it poorly because we did it so slowly, but the scale of the response, nevertheless, is enormous, and I think on some level inspiring. Now it was, you know, it produced backlash and there was resistance, but I think we also found ourselves overstating some of that in order to, prosecute culture war arguments, and also to make ourselves feel better for taking the measures that we did take. I think we've sort of somewhat overstated how much resistance there's been to these measures. Like mask wearing compliances in the U.S. is like over 90%. And yes, there are pockets and places where people are resistant, but like the reason that those videos go viral is because they're relatively rare, actually. And governors have taken counterproductive policies, and yet even in the places where policy has been very proactive, it's still been the case that the population has tended to make those changes first, stopped going out to restaurants first, stopped going out to movies first. It's not that our behavior followed public policy, it's that public policy followed behavior in almost every case. So we took some quite dramatic, even extreme measures that might have been unthinkable a year or so ago, out of concern for one another. And yeah, I think we sort of need to keep that up. What I worry about is that we are just exhausted. And I mean that like literally, I mean that emotionally, I mean that politically, and I also mean that, financially, economically, to the point that we were talking about earlier, which is like we've literally emptied out our treasuries, our central banks, to support ourselves through this time. And I don't know how long that can go on. We probably do need spending of real capital and political capital at this scale if we want to really meaningfully give ourselves a meaningful chance of averting catastrophic climate outcomes. And I don't honestly know how much of that is possible. But the COVID crisis shows us that it's happened once.
Right. It's not unprecedented. It wouldn't be unprecedented.
It's no
That's
longer
a word that's
unprecedented.
scary.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's really encouraging on some level. It's not like, it's not determinative, but it means that, you can say, for instance, if we spent just 10% of the money that we spent on COVID stimulus each of the next 4 years, totaling 40% of the money that the world has spent on COVID stimulus, we could decarbonize the entire planet in the next 15 years and bring ourselves well within the realm of, well, maybe not 15 years, but it would decarbonize the planet fast enough to allow us to meet the targets of the goals of the Paris Accords. And if you had said 2 years ago, you're going to have to spend that many trillions of dollars to do it, probably a lot of people's eyes would have like gone wide and been like, well, that's never going to happen. But saying, well, we got to do only less than half of what we spent on COVID, and we can secure the planet's climate ever after and alleviate the psychological suffering that we're all going through now and the real suffering that we will be living through if we don't do anything, it starts to seem like a manageable price tag.
It's a good trade. I like the stock. Yeah. Yeah. So the very last question, the first line of Uninhabitable Earth is, it is worse, much worse than you think. What would you say today?
Well, it's funny. So when the book sort of grew out of an article I wrote, and the first line of the article I have always liked better, which is only very slightly different, but it is, I promise, worse than you think. And I was like, I can't have the same exact line the second for the book, but I can't. And so I needed just something to like for the rhythm. So I added much worse. I think, honestly, I would still say almost everyone on the planet is in denial about how bad climate change is likely to be. I think something like a 2-degree world is basically our best case outcome. I think that, scientists would tell you that means 150 million people dying of air pollution. It means floods that we used to see every century. Once a century, we will see every single year. It will mean, such intense heat, especially across South Asia and the Middle East, that during summer, cities that are today home to 10 or 12 or 15 million people will be so hot that you can't walk around outside on certain days without risking heat stroke or death. In fact, I saw one calculation recently that in Calcutta, at just 2 degrees, which will likely reach by 2040 or 2050, there will be 200 days of lethal heat every single year. So we're talking about a world like that is really, there's some real grim, gruesome climate features to that world. And that's like our best case scenario. And I think that very few people see clearly how much suffering there would be in that world. But I also think that world, that best case but still terrible world, is really possible. And I might even kind of bet on it, given where we're going. And so to the extent that your nightmares are dominated by civilizational collapse or human extinction, those fears, I think, are not rational, and maybe even amount to a sort of a retreat from the demands of engagement and action, to just be giving up on the problem. We are almost certainly going to be landing in a future in which it is still up to us, and we are still empowered as a species, divided as we are by politics and everything else. It is still in our power to shape and secure the planet's climate future. And the bleaker outcomes in which things get out of our control are almost certainly not going to come to pass. And that means that, probably we're going to be in alternating spasms, surprised and inured to new levels of climate suffering, but also that we will always retain responsibility to do more, to help more people, to alleviate more suffering. And so the question of, how much worse than what you think it's going to get is, it's always uncomfortable to talk in climate in terms of like we and us, because it is such a fractious world, but it is ultimately up to us. And that means, a moral burden on each of us as individuals too.
All right. Well, thank you, David. It's always a pleasure to be with you, despite the subject matter, because of the subject matter. And yeah, I really appreciate it. And I also appreciate just, how clearly you're speaking to, it's not just enough to believe in science, to vote, to have the right bumper stickers, that kind of thing. Like this is a real challenge. It's not a performative challenge. It is something where there's real work to be done. So I really appreciate you calling that out, and all your work, of course.
Well, thanks so much for having me. On that last point, I would just love to add, not to be too long-winded about all of this, but I think it's also worth keeping in mind that the sort of political status quo is considerably more progressive on these issues than it was just a few years ago. And while it's still insufficient, so voting for Joe Biden as opposed to Donald Trump is insufficient, it's also the case that Joe Biden's climate plans and presumably his climate policy will be miles more ambitious than anything that was achieved under Barack Obama. And that pattern is true. It's even more true almost everywhere else in the world. And that is, the result of a lot of these changes that we're talking about. It's a result of natural disasters opening all of our eyes to the threat of climate change. It's a result of the new economics of climate. It's also a result of the changing, price dynamics of renewable energy and our greater understanding of especially the public health costs of dirty energy, all of those things. But in the particular case of Joe Biden, who was, no climate champion's favorite candidate, I think it's largely to the credit of activists here in the U.S. who really, really pushed him to move dramatically left over the course of the campaign in a way that I think you have to credit both of them. You have to credit him for moving, you have to credit them for pushing him. But, I often think about what has been achieved by the Sunrise Movement, and especially by, Varshini Prakash, who's the leader, who I know a little bit, but not super well. this is a group that graded Joe Biden with an F during the primary, and yet made themselves so central to the climate conversation, at least on the American left, that Biden, also being a conciliatory, broad tent kind of a politician, invited her, along with AOC and a few other people who are less to the left of them on climate, to write his climate plan. And the climate plan that emerged was, it calls for $2.5 trillion in spending, which is just, beyond anything that any politician, even a green politician in the US, might have dreamed of as recently as a year or two ago. It's not quite all the way to like what I or Varshini or AOC might want, but it is so far past where we have been before that even if it's compromised down, which it inevitably will be, the ultimate impact is going to be progress. And we always have to keep in mind, just moving in the right direction is not good enough because there's so little time and there's so much to do. But I also think we need to keep in mind that progress is still good and celebrate it when we see it. And even when we see it in, hopelessly establishmentarian politicians like Joe Biden. And it's kind of amazing that climate is now so central to the political energy of the global left and the American left that even someone like Joe Biden can plausibly has become and can plausibly claim to be a kind of a climate champion.
And it seems worth calling out just with AOC and Sunrise, just generationally where they are.
Totally.
And just like how different the norms are, the expectations are, the energy. It's like there's no compromise there. It's like, no, shit's gotta start rolling.
Yeah. And it is. The question is just, how fast.
Well, David, I appreciate it, and talk again soon.
Yeah, great to talk to you.